Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Sadhaka. I'm Jacob Kyle. Today, I'm here with spiritual teacher Shambhavi Sarasvati in the first of 5 conversations held over this coming week on the relationship between spiritual practice, politics, and social justice. Shambhavi and I today are going to chat a little bit about the tension between being a, quote, spiritual person and being an engaged political actor. So, hello, Shambhavi. Thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for having me.
It's nice to see you again.
You too.
Shambhavi has been a recent interviewee on the podcast Chithead, so if you haven't yet listened to that podcast, it's a wonderful interview. And she's also going to be participating in our upcoming conference, Radical Body, Living Tantra for Modern Life, and you can find out more about that in the comments to this post. So, Shambhavi, the inspiration behind us having this chat today was based on a Facebook post that you had put up the other day on Facebook, which resonated with a lot of people, and it remarked on how you'd received a lot of criticism for, or maybe not a lot, but some criticism for being a spiritual teacher who is also engaged and very opinionated politically. So can you talk a little bit about, what the inspiration was behind that post, like what those criticisms were?
Well, that particular day I had received a private Facebook message from someone in India quoting me chapter and verse from various scriptures.
Wow.
Saying that, basically the implication was that I shouldn't call myself a spiritual teacher or person or sannyasini if I'm going to be spouting political opinions or on Facebook or anywhere else. So this is actually a kind of a comment that I get every now and then, and it's based in a transcendental view of life. So it's based in the view that there's something called spirit, and there's something called matter, and matter is everything that we experience every day, including our political life, and bodies, and sexuality, and earthly things. And spirit and spirituality is something divorced from that.
Right.
So it also has to do with ideas of purity and impurity. And of course, all of the prejudices and sexism and body denigration and sexual denigration that we experience comes from that kind of transcendental view, whether it's Christianity or Hinduism, so-called, or any other tradition. In the tradition that I practice in, Trika Shaivism, and also my other tradition, Dzogchen, there is no such division.
Yeah.
And so having an engaged life is not considered to be degraded in any way. There's no sense that nature itself is lesser than or divorced from the fundamental reality, that fundamental enlightened reality, which we could call God or Shiva nature, or there are other names for it in Dzogchen, but every tradition has some name for that basic, aware, alive reality. So there's no sense that there's anything outside of that. And there are many, many beautiful, beautiful ways of expressing this across all of the tantric traditions in India in particular. One of my favorite ways of expressing this, I discovered I was living in Chicago when I was a professor there, and I was just standing at a bus stop, and it was pouring rain, and there was this little used bookstore right behind me at the bus stop, so I just popped in there to basically get out of the rain. And as I walked in the door, I saw this flash of pink to my left on a shelf, and I looked over, and it was a book by the Maharashtrian 14th century poet Gyanadeva. Absolutely one of the most beautiful, devotional, insightful, enlightened pieces of writing I've ever read in my life. So I thank whatever wisdom being sent me into that store and sent that rain chasing me into the bookshop. But in there, he says, one of the things that he writes is, the non-dual one returns to play in the courthouse of duality. So there's this idea in the traditions that I've studied in and practiced in that you realize your nature, you realize that non-dual nature, but then you come back and you play with everything here. Ramakrishna called the human realm the mansion of fun. He was the great devotee of Kali. In the Shakta Tantric tradition of Bengal, this entire manifest reality is referred to as a great city, a place of commerce where you go to meet people and have fun, engaging. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect, that there's something fundamental to the appearing of diversity that includes participation. So that participation isn't going to look the same for every person. I'm not advocating that every person who has a spiritual life become politically involved at all. You know, if you want to go sit on a mountain, fine. But the point is that it can look like anything because everything comes from the same base reality, and that in some sense this whole reality is for participation in whatever way your personality dictates. The other aspect of this is that, excuse me, I have a bit of a cold. The other aspect is that compassion is built into reality. Mm-hmm. It is not something that you have as an individual. This was something that was shown to me very directly as a result of my practice. Compassion is part of the base state of reality. It's part of enlightened essence nature. When you begin to relax your karmas, when you begin to open your heart, compassion happens. Mm-hmm. It is objectless and reasonless. You don't have to have a reason to be compassionate or to act compassionately. And of course, so when you do realize a bit more, you experience more compassion, and that can be demonstrated or expressed really in any number of ways, including by a natural, spontaneous concern for the well-being of others. And it isn't ethical or moralistic. It is simply, I would say, God expressing itself in a spontaneous way that isn't owned by anyone, that never stops, that has no reason or justification, and doesn't need to be generated. It always is there. So I've been involved in political life since I was a young teenager, and I've always enjoyed it. And I when I was younger and before I did any practice, of course, I had this incredibly overheated sense of urgency about everything. And I have this picture of myself when I was about 14 with long hair parted in the middle, very severe, glaring at the camera. And I was wearing this T-shirt that said, "War is not healthy for children and other living things." So this was the atmosphere that I grew up in, and I worked in social justice organizations my entire adult life, up until just the past few years. And as I did more practice, the urgency subsided, the skillfulness rose. The ability to feel compassion for everyone and to not feel any sense of hatred or undue aggression toward political adversaries, that happened also. And so my way of engaging now is very, very different, but it still is some aspect of my personality that I make no apologies for, and I enjoy it a lot.
And you shouldn't. So I want to ask a little bit. So I understand, what you're saying about the distinction between, okay, on the one hand we have this kind of dualistic worldview that's going to separate spirit and matter, and that sort of implies that engagement with the world is something that is below the dignity of spiritual life, and then. But then on the other hand, those that are engaged, and so I want to talk a little bit about those that are engaged, where there's this profound anger. So and on both sides, people that maybe would be on quote unquote our side, right, whatever that may be. But from my understanding, I would imagine that you would maybe say that urgency, what you were talking about, is before that kind of realization that might soften the engagement to something a bit, that comes from a place of more wisdom. So what do you have to say about that anger-fueled kind of activity, which from my perspective seems to be creating even a greater division rather than, it seems like that a lot of people are being very wrong-headed in their approach to bridging the gap, right?
Well, we can't really say they're wrong-headed because being angry is just as natural as anything else.
Right.
It's just more limited.
Okay.
It's more limited because, that kind of anger comes from a profound sense of disappointment and upsetness.
Yeah.
We all have, on some level, contact with a feeling of the virtue of life and the goodness of life. And when everything around us seems to be stomping on that, there's this grief and upsetness that can get translated into anger because just basically it's easier to feel angry.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that anyone's feeling angry deliberately. They're not. That's just how they're feeling. But it's more useful and effective and skillful to understand that when we look in the faces of our adversaries, we're looking in a mirror. When we look in the face of Donald Trump, we're looking in an accumulated karma of a long time of how we've behaved in this country, not just the people who have destroyed a lot of things, but also the lassitude of the people that do care. We haven't really been as active and as insistent on expressing our goodness as we might have been. So to open your heart and to feel tender and to have the courage to look in the face of your adversary and see your own limitations, that makes you more effective. And it's a richer way of living. So I don't want to criticize anyone who's feeling angry. I understand it, and I don't think it's any less natural than anything else.
Yeah.
But to look behind that and to see the grief and the way that people's hearts are hurting, it is hard to see so much ignorance in charge. But the way that I see things right now is that we have this incredibly stark contrast between the wonderful open-heartedness that is kind of percolating up in, I think, quite a new way in younger generations, and their more connected way of relating to other people in the world and to our planet. And this, older way that's more about divisiveness and individuality and greed and, every man for himself, basically. So the fact that the contrast is so stark and the inevitability of those older generations passing away and the newer generations taking over, I have never seen such a stark contrast. Makes me think that we're at a juncture, what is called in the Mahabharata a crack in time, a change in eras. And at the change in eras, there has to be destruction. So we're seeing how destructive ignorance is, and it's ignorance that must be destroyed. But how it's destroyed is through open-heartedness. Always. That is natural law.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mean that we can't take decisive action. It doesn't mean that we can't be aggressive when that's called for. But we have to try to do everything with open-heartedness, because it is open-heartedness that will bring in wisdom into whatever comes next, will bring greater wisdom into whatever comes next.
So in that sense, would you say then that it's possible to have both a kind of righteous anger and be open-hearted at the same time?
No.
So when you're open-hearted, you're past anger. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, you're not past grief.
Right.
And you're not past fierceness.
Okay.
So anger is a limited form of clarity.
Okay.
Anyone can understand that when you're angry, even if you're angry about the most ridiculous thing, there's a kind of a cutting through quality of anger.
Yeah.
That cutting through quality is the wisdom essence of anger.
Mm.
So when the heart opens, anger turns into the clarity of Kali. where she just chops off the head of ignorance. Okay? So it is no longer what we would identify as righteous anger, right? It is, but it is blazing, lightning strike kind of clarity. And so if we can liberate our anger through waking up a little bit more, then we can have, first of all, total confidence in the victory of wisdom over ignorance. This is just part of a natural cycle, and wisdom will win. And we can deal much more skillfully. When we have righteous anger, that is draining anger. I mean, that is draining awareness out from us. We're seeing everything through this cloud of righteous anger.
Yeah.
And then we go, what do we do? We go and we, like what happened at Berkeley, we punch somebody in the face.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sure that felt good. But we just had this discussion in Satsang the other night because one of my students was very gleeful about this having happened. And I could see this by the look on his face. He was just kind of getting his yayas out, thinking how great this was. But all that is getting your yayas out. It's not effective political action.
Yeah. That's really great. I'm really happy you said that about anger because I'm happy you said the original thought about like anger being just as natural because I've definitely been feeling a lot of anger, but then also pointing us in the direction, of something more skillful. So what would be kind of your invitation or your message to people right now who are wanting to be really engaged, who are maybe I don't want to say suffering, but who are dealing with a lot of grief and anger and want to be effective? What would be your advice?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, when I look at Donald Trump, I see the absolute nth degree expression of our Titan culture. Our culture that values competitiveness, individual achievement, and beating out the other guy.
Yeah.
So if you want to get rid of Donald Trump, you have to get rid of the Titan in yourself. And we have all got some of that because we live in such a Titan culture. So when you try to best somebody or stomp on somebody or you argue ridiculously to try to be right even when you know you're wrong. And when you get into that super competitive mode where you really don't care how other people feel, when you're bragging, when you're self-aggrandizing, when you're exaggerating, which are just rife in the spiritual world, whenever you are doing any of those things, you are being Donald Trump. So I would suggest first that you look to that and try to divest yourself of that behavior. Try to really have a hard look at it. Because if you want to get rid of Donald Trump, it doesn't do any good just to get rid of the one Donald Trump. We have to get rid of all Donald Trump.
The billions of Donald Trump.
Exactly. I mean, most of us are not doing it to that degree. He's on a grand scale, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't even have the energy to be a Titan on that scale.
Wow.
But we all have some of that in us. I have never met a single person from our culture, not any student of mine or any person I've ever met who doesn't have some of that I'm going to beat out the other guy type of attitude, which hides some kind of insecurity about our place in the world and are we good enough. So
such a good message.
Try to get in touch with your own goodness, your own virtue, that absolutely adamantine, indestructible virtue that you are made of. Because that's the only thing that's going to assuage your insecurity about yourself. And then, seeing that we are all related to those who are on, as you said, the other side. That's very, very important. And then continue to take strong action to express your deepest values, your highest aspirations, your goodness through your activities in whatever way you can. And that's going to look different for all of us, but we cannot give up. And I think that I'm such a skeptic about the change of generations. I never think anything's going to change just because the generation changes. And when people used to tell me, oh, the younger generation is so different.
They always say that. Yeah.
I know, I would just roll my eyes and, whatever. But I actually do think that something different has happened, and I'm not going to go into all the reasons why, but I do think we are at a juncture in the eras of time. And I do think that there's some new expression of wisdom and goodness and virtue coming down the pike. And everyone should express their virtue as much as they possibly can in every single area of their lives, including just how you treat the checkout person at the supermarket. Let your kindness out, let your tenderness out, and express that in your political life also. Political life, the best, in my mind, the most effective political life comes from a feeling of tenderness and concern, not anger. And of course, I felt anger a lot in my life. So I'm not trying to put anybody down about it. But if we want a new world, it has to come from open-heartedness.
Wow. That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Shambhavi. That's such a beautiful message. I think this is going to be really a favorite of people's to watch this and listen to you speak about such an important topic right now. So, speaking of kind of the change in times, you are currently doing a course on a massive text that is about a change in eras, correct?
Yeah,
Do you
it's
want to
the
talk
Mahabharata.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that and how people can maybe tune in and take that class with you?
Yeah, it's not really a class. It's actually what is called a satsang.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a conversation. And we are basically reading the text together, myself and whoever shows up at satsang, and then we're having a discussion. So the text is it's an Indian epic, a text from India, and it's about a crack in time. It's about a change from a more aggressive, competitive, warlike time to a time when wisdom reigns more openly. And it's about a single family that's been divided in two and are at war with each other, one representing ignorance and one representing wisdom. But the beautiful thing is that nobody in the text is either entirely wise nor entirely ignorant. Everybody's a mixed bag.
Mm-hmm.
There really couldn't be a more perfect thing to read. And I know from the comments my students have made that it's giving them a bigger container in which to experience these truly upsetting times that we're in, and helping them to put everything into perspective and to act more skillfully. So you can come live if you happen to be in Maine, in Portland, Maine. I'm teaching every Wednesday night. We have satsang with the Mahabharata. And then there's also a podcast, the Mahabharata with Shambhavi, which you can get on any podcast app. If you really get into it, you can sign up for an annual subscription and join an online discussion that is a companion to the live satsang.
Amazing. Thank you, Shambhavi. And
Thanks for giving me this chance, Jacob.
Yeah, absolutely. And Shambhavi's website is jayakula.org, JAYAKULA.org. So definitely check that out. She's got some lovely writings and some of her audio teachings. And are there some videos as well on there?
There are videos on YouTube of satsangs. There's also my regular podcast is Satsang with Shambhavi. Actually, Jacob, it's you that got me started on the podcast thing.
Oh, good. That's
I had
amazing.
a very, very erroneous idea that podcasts were a thing of the past and no one cared about them.
No, they're very popular right now.
I know. You made me realize that. So anyway, also I'll just mention that I'm going to be in Portland, Oregon at the beginning of March. I think March 7th through 12th. So if you're on the West Coast and you want to come to Teachings Live, I'll be there.
All right. And you can find information about that stuff on the website as well?
On the website, yeah.
All right. Wonderful. All right. Thank you so much, Shambhavi. It's been such a pleasure.
Have
Talk to you
day.
soon. Okay.